you sit with the Democrats? Huh? I've got to leave in a little bit. I don't want to walk in front of our witness.
Yeah, I'll take it. As long as you can put on Mr. Keating's Massachusetts.
I'm not gonna, I can't stay too long, and so I don't want to walk in
That's
front
fine,
of
that's fine.
Secretary Paul.
We got a big tent. Where am I now? I get changed around more times. Would you push that over to the front? I was in your neck of the woods for about 10 days. Your neck of the woods. Yeah.
Put together a good one in Serbia, Bosnia, Eurasia.
that they put together last night from the Democrats too. Different questions. But I put some in there for you too.
You know, these letters are very small.
Is that on?
I know.
I hereby call this hearing to order. Good afternoon, and welcome to this hearing on the legacy of the Dayton Agreement and political situation in Bosnia and what portends to be for the Western Balkans. I suspect today's topic may be new to some of my younger colleagues. The horrific conflict of the 1990s and its underlying causes is something many of us hope had been resolved a long time ago. But here we are. The issue at hand stems from the fundamental compromise within the 1995 Dayton Agreement. To end 3 years of war and genocide, Bosnia's democratic development and territorial integrity was balanced against the need to accommodate ethnic interests. For peace, this trade-off made sense. The time has come, however, not just for stability, but for political reform as well. Political reform that allows Bosnia to have a fully functional government, one that meets democratic standards. Based on the Dayton Agreement, Bosnia is divided into two political entities: the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which in and of itself has been divided into 10 cantons, and the Republic of Serbia, let me pronounce it right? Srpska. Okay, I want to make sure I'm pronouncing that. Srpska. The three major ethnic communities, Bosniak, Serbs, and Croats, share power. Bosnia-Herzegovina is headed at the state level, for example, by a tripartite presidency, one for each of the ethnic communities. It is a complex and overlapping system where positions are allowed and allotted by affiliation of one of the three ethnic groups, sometimes to the exclusion of citizens who do not belong to any of the ethnic groups. While this system secured in the group rights of one warring party for 2 decades of democratic change has resulted in a situation, however, where equal representation of an individual citizen is viewed as a threat to protecting the political equality between the ethnic groups. Bosniaks in the Federation, for example, may now make up 70% of that population. The electoral law set up a scenario, however, where a representative of one community may be duly elected, but an ethnicity other than his own. So the Constitutional Court of Bosnia found that this violated the equality between the ethnic communities set forth in the Constitution and undercut key provisions of the electoral law. Because the political parties were unable to find a compromise solution to this within the required time frame, Bosnia is approaching a general election this October without election law in place. This has created a potential for a political crisis and hopefully not for the loss of life and conflict. The current set of ethnocentric political parties and entrenched elites have regrettably been unable or unwilling to find a solution for the good of the country and its people. Given our country's history and involvement in the region, and particularly our central role in brokering the Dayton Agreement, the United States has an ongoing responsibility to help Bosnians find a mutually agreeable and lasting solution. We cannot, however, just sit on the sidelines and expect the Europeans and the European Union to solve this. That's something we should have learned by now. Experience has shown us Europe often lacks the political resolve to lead, and active engagement now will lessen the likelihood of more challenging intervention later on. We have two panels for today's hearing, and first we will hear from our State Department and then a panel of private witnesses. So I thank all of you for appearing today, and now I turn to my ranking member, Mr. Meeks, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Rohrabacher, for calling this hearing and continuing to focus our subcommittee's attentions on the Balkans. I am particularly excited about shining a helpful light on Bosnia, where we are witnessing a country amble towards a constitutional crisis, barring a solution. Additionally, I'm grateful to have a veteran of our State Department here to testify. I always salute those in the State Department and the great work that they do for our country, and they think sometimes it goes unrecognized, but I want to thank you for what you do. I look forward to hearing about your recent trip to the region and key takeaways on the broader issues. It was an understanding by many here in Congress that the region was moving steadily towards the West and closer to the institutions that are markers for our democratic principles, NATO and the EU. In fact, just yesterday, the Commission backed EU accession talks for Albania and Macedonia. This is a very encouraging announcement, but the follow-through is what is tough. Whereas there was and is momentum in this direction, the progress has slowed, and leaders are looking at playing the West off of Russia. Populations aren't as convinced of the benefits of NATO or EU membership as they once was, and outside actors, namely Turkey and Russia, are increasingly interested and willing to insert themselves in a detrimental manner, thereby jeopardizing the investments that the United States has made towards the democratic peace. The United States, who helped broker that peace, is nervously turning inwards, unfortunately. And the leaders in the region, however, underestimate the extent to which the United States institutions and people are committed to the goals of individual rights, democracy, and peace. By focusing on Bosnia and Herzegovina,
You got it.
electoral framework and constitutions, Congress can help avert a crisis and keep perhaps even use this opportunity to reinvigorate the push to a rules-based political system in Bosnia. The way it stands now, and without sufficient attention from the West, the Bosnian elite are allowed to continue to drift towards this crisis. Worse, a haphazard fix to the legal gap can be used to cement the divide between the political economic elites and the constituent peoples. The conundrum needs to be addressed. However, and the maligned actors outside of Bosnia and in the neighborhood are hardly waiting until the October elections to act. In the United States, we sometimes want simple answers to very complex situations. We start afresh, move to new cities, go bankrupt, and try again. We sometimes misunderstand the role of history in much older cultures than ours. In Bosnia, it is impossible to separate the past from the present and the future. The brave people, all constituent peoples, understand what risk there is to this political game of chicken. There are the seeds that need to be tended to and that need to be the vital force of the political solution. I believe there is a role for the United States here, first and foremost in taking up responsibility for the consequences of Dayton and for our strategic interests in the region. We must honestly rethink the strictures of the accords and how an immediate fix can lead to better governance in the region. And we can only be successful here. Indeed, the region can only be successful if we do this in concert with our allies. The EU and even some of its larger member states, significantly the UK, have shown renewed interest in the region. As the co-chair of the EU caucus and ranking member on the European Subcommittee, I want to harness that positive energy and use it to advance our common interests, starting in Bosnia and spreading it throughout the region. And again, I thank all who's going to testify, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing today.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. Our first witness of the day is Matt Palmer, a senior, is this on? Okay. A senior Foreign Service officer and currently serving as acting. No? Is it on now? Okay. A senior Foreign Service officer and currently acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Europe and the Western Balkans. He has completed tours in Serbia, Cyprus, and has worked for the National Security Council at the White House. Let me just note, I am deeply concerned, along with a lot of other people, that we just have acting Deputy Assistant Secretaries of State rather than this administration having appointed permanent people to those positions. But we're very happy to have you with us. We know you're a pro, so go right ahead. You've got about 5 minutes, and then we'll open up for questions.
Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Meeks, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to appear before you today to discuss the challenges that we see in Bosnia and Herzegovina and our strategy for addressing them. I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the House of Representatives and this committee for your interest in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I recently returned from a trip to the region, and I can tell you that the people of Bosnia and Herzegovina share our desire to see their country integrated with the West. We have a long history of good relations with Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's a member of the Global Coalition to Defeat ISIS, a solid partner on counterterrorism, and a proactive counterpart in efforts to limit the spread of violent extremism. The country is, however, facing its most serious challenges since the 1990s, which, left unchecked, could have serious consequences for the Western Balkans, Europe, and the United States. There is a real risk that national elections in Bosnia and Herzegovina this fall could fail to produce a government unless political leaders can reach agreement on reforms to the country's electoral law. Without a government, the country could face a prolonged post-election crisis, during which progress would stall on pressing objectives such as tackling corruption, strengthening rule of law, countering violent extremism, and furthering the country's Euro-Atlantic integration. Basic governmental responsibilities such as passing a budget would become impossible. Most importantly, Such internal problems in Bosnia and Herzegovina open the door to malign actors such as Russia, which is intent on sowing chaos in the region and thwarting Bosnia's Euro-Atlantic future. To ensure that election results can be implemented, Bosnia and Herzegovina's political leaders must find compromises that balance the collective rights of the country's three constituent peoples, Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs, with the individual rights of all citizens, both of which are enshrined in the Constitution. The tension between these principles has been reflected in a number of cases filed with the Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the European Court of Human Rights. Current electoral reform efforts are aimed at finding balanced solutions consistent with the decisions of these courts. The most pressing reform issue concerns elections to the upper chamber of parliament, known as the House of Peoples of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. In December 2016, the Constitutional Court ruled that the electoral mechanism to establish the House of Peoples was inconsistent with the Constitution and gave the state parliament 6 months to fix the election law. When Parliament failed to do so, the court invalidated these sections of the law, and in doing so effectively eliminated the legal basis for establishing the House of Peoples. Without a fully constituted House of Peoples, it will be impossible to form either the Federation government or the state-level House of Peoples, the upper house of the Parliamentary Assembly. The Constitutional Court of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the European Court of Human Rights have also ruled in numerous cases that constitutional provisions governing elections to the presidency are discriminatory. Under the current setup, anyone who is not from one of the three major ethnic groups is ineligible to run for president. Fixing this would require amending the state constitution, a time-consuming task that will require significant political will. We have seen no proposal that satisfactorily addresses this issue. Because of time constraints, we are urging the political parties to prioritize reforms related to the House of Peoples and hold off further consideration of the presidency until after the October elections. The State Department has engaged at all levels in support of efforts to reform the electoral process. Over the last year, we have met regularly with the leaders of key political parties to encourage them to work together towards consensus. Ambassador Maureen Cormack and her staff at the U.S. Embassy in Sarajevo have led an electoral reform facilitation process since last October, bringing parties together to negotiate a mutually agreeable solution. I had the opportunity to meet with all three members of the presidency while in Sarajevo earlier this month, as well as with other leaders from across the political spectrum. We have also engaged international partners who support Bosnia and Herzegovina's Euro-Atlantic ambitions to discuss how to best advance electoral reform and promote rule of law. In addition to helping political leaders agree on electoral reforms, we're taking steps to shore up rule of law and stamp out corruption by pressing the government to accelerate reforms and providing targeted assistance. We're also urging political leaders and criminal justice institutions to demonstrate the political will and courage necessary to investigate, prosecute, and punish corrupt actors and the organized crime groups they protect far more aggressively. We are working to spur economic growth by improving the business climate. A stable, prosperous Bosnia and Herzegovina that is integrated within the Western community of nations and is a strong partner on counterterrorism helps make America safer, is a better place for U.S. business, and will bolster peace, stability, and prosperity in the region. These goals are ambitious, but we are committed to seeing a democratic, prosperous Bosnia and Herzegovina closely partnered with the United States in advancing our common interests. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you very much for that testimony today. What are the chances, what do you give us? We're going to avert a major crisis, or is it a coin flip? Is it 50-50? Is it, hey, we got it all straightened out, we're just now doing things underneath the radar screen?
I don't want to underestimate the challenge, Mr. Chairman. This is a difficult set of negotiations that are ongoing between and amongst the parties in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I'm reluctant to put a number on it. Vegas style.
Let me put it this way: if you're over 50%, you're optimistic, right? If you're under 50%, you're pessimistic. Yeah. What are you?
For me, Mr. Chairman, I'm committed to working as hard as we can to help these guys get across the finish line.
Oh, that's a good answer there. That's
in that case, sir, I'm going to stop right there.
All right. Do you really think that it is possible for them to give up this sort of ethnic organizational structure that we brought in, everybody brought in as part of the way to end the actual killing that was going on? Can we now drift away from that? And is that possible?
Chairman, I don't think that they need to give it up as such. And I don't think that's what anybody is looking for out of this process, or really what anybody thinks is realistic. The goal is to adjust and amend the electoral law in such a way to ensure that the balance between the collective rights of the constituent peoples, Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs, and the rights of individual citizens of Bosnia, not all of whom belong to one of these three ethnic groups.
Sure.
That balance is struck appropriately in a manner that is consistent with the Bosnian Constitution, consistent with international norms, and with European law.
Well, you know, something that has to be fine-tuned that much. It seems to me that it's very hard for us to fine-tune things overseas. Americans usually come in with a sledgehammer, which is what we did during the Balkan War last time. We came in with a sledgehammer. We were bombing Belgrade, for Pete's sakes. And I think that our heavy hand in that region helped end that massive killing. I think we can be proud that we stood with our allies in Western Europe and accomplished that and saving a lot of lives. I don't know from what you're saying and what we're looking at right now whether or not we came up with a solution or just a stopgap proposal that people are trying to implement until the fighting starts again. Let me ask you this: if fighting does break out in Bosnia, let's say, for example, would that spill over into the rest of the Balkans, or would you think that would be able to be contained right in Bosnia?
That is a complex hypothetical question, Mr. Chairman.
Of course it is.
I'm reluctant to engage in hypotheticals, and at this point, we see no immediate risk of violence in Bosnia. But I mean, certainly our experience in the past has been that violence in any place in the Balkans has an immediate and negative effect on stability within its neighbors across the region. It would be of profound concern were that to be the case in Bosnia. I think that the risk of spillover of that violence into undermining overall regional stability would be significant.
Yeah, eventually, what you have is, you know, your Croatians, you have your Serbians, and you have, of course, your Albanians there, and these people have their different religions. They have a huge history of conflict over centuries, and I think that would be naive to think that it's going to be easy for us to just sort of get everybody to hold hands and come up with a compromise that will permit them to not kill each other, but we'll see. Could you tell me who, and by the way, again, I think we need to, as Congressman Meeks mentioned, we need to be proud of you folks who have been doing the bidding of the United States of America to try to be a peacekeeper in that area. There's nothing, I think, more honorable than being peacekeepers and peacemakers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Now, but there's the yin and the yang. Are there negative forces? What about we have the Chinese are now recognizable players in the area. We got the Turks, and the Turks seem to be going in exactly the wrong direction. And now we got the Russians. Okay. Are these players, if you could go into very quickly, are these players being a positive influence, or is this a drag? What's your analysis of these various things? And also, by the way, we have to recognize that you know, radical Islam is still around, and that's something people are worried about. So what about those outside factors?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. This is something that we watch very closely. The outside actor who is of particular concern to us at this point in time is the Russian Federation, and their goals, not just in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but across the region, are fundamentally at odds with our goals. We're working to help the countries of the Western Balkans integrate into European and Euro-Atlantic institutions. The Russians are working assiduously to sow distrust and discord. This is of concern to us. It's concern to us what it is that's happening at the state-to-state level, and it's also of concern to us what's happening in terms of Russian disinformation, Russian support for groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina that are working to tear apart the social fabric of Bosnia-Herzegovina, to
So you think they're being, the Russians are playing a role of provocateur?
I think that's a perfectly reasonable description, Mr. Chairman.
It's shocking.
Shocking, shocking. I will go back to maybe a second round with this witness and Mr. Meeks.
Thank you. I'm going to drop the Deputy Assistant Secretary. Let me ask this question.
It is a mouthful, Mr. Meeks, yes.
There are certain Bosnian Croat political leaders, particularly those from the HDZ political party, who claim to speak on behalf of the entire Bosnian Croat community. Is that community really united in its views? I mean, are they saying it, but is it really united in its views? And those living in central Bosnia share the aims and the goals of those living in Herzegovina? I can't get it out of my mouth. Herzegovina.
That's a complex question, Ranking Member Meeks. I would say that, you know, there's no group anywhere in the Balkans that's entirely homogeneous in terms of their goals and aspirations, their political orientation, their understanding of their own self-interests. So all of these communities are complex. You know, we speak in shorthand, and the shorthand mantra that we have for Bosnia is one country, two entities, three constituent peoples. I have that tattooed somewhere on the back of my hand, so I don't forget. But within those constituent communities, there you'll find a wide spectrum of opinions. However, we do have duly elected leaders from these communities. We have political parties that, through a competitive political process, have come to the fore to represent the interests of their communities. And what we're trying to do at this point is to work together with these representatives of the constituent peoples in Bosnia and Herzegovina to try and find a path forward towards mutual agreement. That's our goal. We don't support any particular resolution, any particular set of electoral reforms. We do want to see electoral reforms that are robust, that are durable, that are consistent with Bosnia's constitutions and international norms and the rulings of the European courts, given Bosnia's aspirations eventually to become a member of the European Union.
Let me ask this question, which is particularly sensitive or enlightening to me, given the history of us here, even in the United States, and trying to, where you have people of different ethnicities trying to live together, living in the same communities. I'm one of the product where one way we try to overcome that, and we're still trying to do it to a degree here in the United States, is integrate schools so that people are going to school together, they're going to learn about one another, they understand that they, they have different ethnicities, but they still have the same kind of blood and organs and everything. They're human beings. What are we doing? Are we doing anything to try to help along to end segregation among students on ethnic lines and having them going to school together and things of that nature?
Yes, Mr. Meeks. We are working through a variety of programs and assistance efforts and activities to promote tolerance, to create opportunities in particular for young people to interact, to ensure that the curriculums of the schools are, to the extent possible, stripped of the kinds of heated rhetoric that can pit neighbor against neighbor, something that we saw on too regular a basis in the Balkans in the 1990s. This is a challenging environment for this. The traditions in the Balkans, the political traditions, are different than they are in the United States. We have a tradition of prioritizing the rights of the individual. In the Balkans, the rights of individuals are also significant, but they also do have a degree of comfort and experience with collective rights, group rights, that are a little bit alien to American political culture. And so what we're trying to help them do is to find a balance between this concept of collective rights, the rights of a community, the rights of a constituent people, which are enshrined in the Dayton Constitution, the Constitution of Bosnia and Herzegovina, to balance those collective rights against the rights of the individual and find a way for the society to work and function as smoothly and effectively as it can. It is a different tradition than the American tradition, but it's one that we feel can be entirely consistent with a democratic future for Bosnia.
Thank you. I know this says we're gonna go to another round, so.
All right.
First, Mr. Chairman, thank you and Ranking Member Meeks for allowing me to unanimous consent to come in and sit in on the meeting. Secretary, good to see you. Last month, I sent a letter to the Assistant Secretary Mitchell, and Dober Don, to anybody in the crowd here, regarding the issue. The United States has significant investment, and it's been 25, 26 years on now, and I think what this is symptomatic of the Dayton Accord, which in my mind wasn't really supposed to last more than 20 years. I mean, it was up to the country to come up with changes that more suited their circumstances and let the people and those citizens decide that. And I did get a response to my inquiry from Ms. Waters, and I suppose she was as descriptive as she could be, but it's pretty broad-ranging. And so I a couple specific questions. If the three parties can't come together with some agreement, what are the range of options? Can it be delayed? Is that realistic? Can you put and I understand you're not making these decisions, but you must be hearing the discussions, and things are looming, and you just run out of time to implement some of this stuff. And as I recall, I mean, when I was there, we had an election of 2,500 parties, right? Individual political parties or something along that line. If you imagine how unpleasant these elections here in the United States, imagine that there. So I'm wondering what the other options are. I'm also wondering about capabilities, since a lot of the weapons were taken out of the country and so on and so forth. What are the capabilities of the different factions, other than sowing discord, et cetera, or Russia and Turkey providing anything hard, so to speak, that could be used, or is that available? And then finally, are there significant dates surrounding the election? Because I can't remember all this stuff, but it seems, as I recall, that in this country they seem to memorialize certain dates that are associated with infractions going to the past. And so if there are certain dates that come up around election time where certain infractions of the past occurred, that might be an opportunity, unfortunately, to reignite tensions or sore feelings. And so those are, and what's, I know I'm giving you a laundry list here. Where does this issue fall on the State Department's priority list for Bosnia? Because as Mr. Meeks talked about, one school, two schools under one roof. I mean, I'm sure that's a priority. Corruption remains a priority. There's a lot of priorities. But I'm wondering where this falls in the priority for state as far as you know.
Thank you for those questions, Mr. Perry. Let's begin at the top, I suppose, with this issue of what the alternatives are. And I would put to you, sir, that there's really no point where we stop working these issues. That at no point are we going to wash our hands of Bosnia and Herzegovina? Are we going to say that this problem is simply too hard? And we surrender.
I'm not implying that, but I'm wondering if at some point where this was always an ongoing issue of constitutional provisions and the governance and so on and so forth, but this, I think at some point reaches crisis level, and I don't know at what point State Department considers it such, but I sent a letter last month, so obviously I'm already there.
The crisis point that we're looking ahead to, Mr. Perry, is the elections in the fall in October, and the risk that these elections fail in the baseline responsibility of an election, which is to produce a government. And if Bosnia doesn't have a government, they can stumble along for some time with people in acting capacities, with technical mandates. There's experience with this in that part of the world. But there comes a point where the failure to adopt a budget means that they don't have the money available to make the necessary expenditures. And when basic services, And when you stop paying war veterans, when you stop providing pensions, when you stop collecting the trash, that's when people go out in the streets. And that produces instability that is visible and dangerous to all. So that we'd like to avoid getting to that point. And the negotiations that we're supporting and facilitating in Sarajevo right now are aimed at helping the parties reach an agreement that will prevent that crisis. I can't tell you exactly.
I mean, I
when it would
appreciate
happen.
that, but yet I haven't heard any other option other than we hope they get to a consensus, which is, look, we're all hoping, I think everybody in the room is interested in that, but if they don't,
Sure. I think the answer to that,
What's
Mr. Perry, would
the
be that if
reality
they
here?
don't, and they get to October, and there is no government, and you have this incipient crisis, that you try again, right? And you try again with the pressures of the budget breathing down your neck. And when there is pressure on the political leaders to avert the kind of crisis, the kind of civil unrest, that
I know
that
I've
could
asked
be
you a lot of
function
questions, and I'm way over, so we'll just continue the conversation, I hope.
Thanks,
All
sir.
right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I'm looking at this political system of Bosnia and Herzegovina. I can't make heads or tails. It looks like the NCAA tournament bracketing.
Yeah, it's pretty complicated, sir.
I mean, but can you tell me if the Dayton Accord needs to be reformed?
Well, I think that what we're talking about here, Mr. Sires, is in fact reforming the Dayton Accords at the micro level. We're trying to make adjustments to the system that Dayton established to help the Bosnian political system fit more smoothly into the international system, to accommodate international and European norms. One of the big things that needs to get fixed in Bosnia is the method of selecting the presidency. The problem with that, I think, is pretty clear. If you're not a Serb and you're not a Croat and you're not a Bosniak, you cannot run for the presidency of Bosnia and Herzegovina. There's something fundamentally wrong with that, and that shortcoming has been recognized in a number of decisions by the European courts. Fixing that, amending that, finding a way to resolve that conundrum will require changing the Constitution. That is changing Dayton, because the Constitution is part of Dayton. So yes, there will need to be changes. I would not argue that it's necessary at this point to consider wholesale changes. I wouldn't throw the whole thing out and start over again, but to work in making the immediate amendments and fixes and reforms that are necessary to make that spaghetti gram more functional.
And what are the prospects of joining the EU?
Long term, there's a process. It's gonna take time. Bosnia has a lot of reforms that it needs to implement. Reforms related to governance, reforms related to rule of law, reforms related to transparency, accountability, functionality. So it is our hope and expectation that the process of aspiring to be a member of the European Union, opening the negotiations, opening and closing the various chapters that are part of that accession process, that will help Bosnia make the reforms necessary to be more functional, to be more effective, to be more viable as a unitary state.
And looking at this chart, the central bank, would that be the treasury, comparable to ours?
No, there is a central bank separate from the Ministry of Finance. So I think it's probably closer to the Federal Reserve.
Have to make this out here.
Bigger type helps.
Okay, thank you.
We'll have time for a couple minutes more from each of the members. Let me just note that if this doesn't come about any faster than what we've seen in the last 25 years in terms of reaching compromises, seems that your goal, that the goal you're outlining is that we're going to get everybody ready and we're going to put them into the EU and they're going to be in the EU. I don't think the EU is going to be around that long. So, I mean, I hate to tell you this, but I'm trying, I'll give you the honest assessment from here. I think the EU is on the way out. And however, I do think that it's possible that there a new type of coalition is forming in Europe that will include, could go all the way down into the Balkans from what we consider Central and what Eastern Europe now, with Poland and Austria, and Czech Republic, Hungary, maybe Romania and Bulgaria, maybe Serbia, et cetera. That may be what you end up with when all is said and done. I don't know. Do these people, let me ask you this, I'm not an expert, although I've been there, thanks to Joe and Shirley, actually took me there once, but do Serbs and Croatians and the Albanians, and like with the Kosovo, do they speak different languages? Can they talk to one another?
Yeah, the issue of language is intensely political in the Balkans. So Croats would tell you they speak Croatian. Bosniaks would tell you they speak Bosnian. Serbs speak Serbian. I understand them all. So they can speak to each other. There's different words, there's different accents, but they're mutually intelligible for sure. Albanian's a different language altogether. So it's not a Slavic language. It's unrelated to any of the other languages.
And what percentage of the Bosnian population speaks that language?
Of the Bosnian population speaks Albanian?
Yes, do they?
It would be under 1, I'm pretty sure.
Okay, so that's small. How
Very
many
small
speak
minority.
Croatian? And is that different than Serbian?
They're mutually intelligible, Mr. Chairman. So I don't know that we have a language count. I think if you were to do a census, and again, the issue of the census is pretty politicized too, but the numbers who identify as Croat could be taken as a placeholder for the numbers who speak Croatian.
And is there an ethnic divide here as well? Meaning, can someone see someone walking down the street and say, aha, that's a Serbian, or aha, that's a Bosnian, or whatever?
Almost certainly not, Mr. Chairman. There might be some differences of dress, particularly for religious Bosniaks that would be identifiable, but in general, no. You can't just look at somebody and know what they are.
Sounds like a hell of a project to try to get them to work together, seeing that we can't see the differences, but they feel it so strongly, and that's fascinating. Well, thank you for the insights you've given us today. We, of course, wish you success. And Mr. Meeks, do you have any other questions?
Well, I just ask one quick one.
Absolutely, Ranking Member Meeks, they do. I have spoken about this issue at length with senior decision makers in both Zagreb and Belgrade, and both governments understand that they would stand to lose significantly from instability in Bosnia. That the challenges that Bosnia poses are not specific to Bosnia, they're region-wide. And so there is considerable interest on the part of the governments in Zagreb and the government in Belgrade in partnering with us, working together, trying to help us move Bosnia closer towards a stable, prosperous. They are working with us. I think there is more that we can expect from them, and we have made that case in both Zagreb and Belgrade. Certainly, Zagreb has a lot of influence over the leadership of the Bosnian Croat community, as Belgrade has a lot of influence over the Bosnian Serb community and the Bosnian Serb leadership, and we have encouraged them to use that influence constructively in pursuit of peace and stability.
I used the figure 70%. Go right ahead.
No, I forgot because I just needed to say one thing, because, you know, the chairman is my good friend, et cetera, but there are times that we disagree on certain things, and I just want to say that wherever disagreement is, it will not be in the best interest of the United States if we don't have a strong EU. And I would hope that the EU will continue to be moving and thriving, and folks are looking and pushing, going that direction. And I think that the EU nations are looking to work together to make sure, because we know how bad things were post-World War II. It's been much safer and much better with a united Europe And we've got to continue to focus and make sure that happens. So I just had to get that in there for the record.
Share that hope and expectation.
That's successful. You can have a independent bank that dominates your economic system. Wonder who, we don't know. Anyway, that's a whole other issue about who controls money supply and whether or not that's something that should be done by people who are elected by the people of the country, or whether that can just be independent. But that's a whole other issue that we will talk about in another hearing. There you go. Again, thank you. Let me ask you one thing. So are the Serbs playing a positive role now in what you're talking about today and trying to find this peace, or are they playing a negative role?
I think that the government in Belgrade has the same goals and objectives that we have for Bosnia, which is an integral, stable, prosperous country that functions. Do I think there's more that Belgrade can do to help us secure that goal? Yes, sir, I do. And we have been in discussions with President Vučić, Prime Minister Brnabić, and others as to what it is that we would hope Belgrade would contribute to that effort.
Mr. Perry, do you have a couple minutes that you'd like to?
Of course, Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Go right ahead.
So getting back, Mr. Secretary, capabilities, if you will. Are there capabilities that exist that we need to be aware of from a military standpoint, from a police standpoint, or is it just going to be harsh language if there's discord?
At this point, sir, we would not anticipate that this political challenge becomes a military challenge. This is not, that Bosnia is not on the brink of
That's
war.
good. That's good to know. But what are the capabilities?
If you're thinking about just in terms of raw capabilities, there's certainly plenty of weapons that are sloshing around the Western Balkans, and there have been for a long time. There is an army that is a unitary army. Bosnia only has one army. One of the great accomplishments post-Dayton was negotiating the reunification of the Bosnian army.
Does the Bosnian army include heavy weapons like tanks, armored personnel carriers, Air Force?
They do have some heavy weapons, artillery, tanks, APCs. I think the Air Force has such, maybe a few helicopters.
Okay.
You know, there's also the police forces in Bosnia and Herzegovina, of which there are a myriad, and police forces in that part of the world are more heavily armed than police in the United States. So that's another issue to be aware of, to watch out for. The Ministry of Interior forces in Republika Srpska recently purchased several thousand automatic weapons, assault rifles.
Where did they purchase those?
Purchased from Serbia.
From Serbia, and it's in accordance with the Dayton Accord, correct?
It's not inconsistent with the Dayton Accords, but it is something that raised some eyebrows in
because it's
Bosnia
not
and
in the military, but it's in the police force. But
police force, and people do remember from back in the 90s that the police fought.
Right, which is the reason I asked the question. Okay, what about any significant dates surrounding the election that might be of import, knowing that they memorialize atrocities and infractions time after time?
Are an awful lot of those dates, Mr. Perry, and I can't off the top of my head think of any that would surround the dates for the elections in October, but they haven't announced those dates yet.
Is that something the State Department considers to be mindful of, the dates, locations, et cetera, in this whole discussion? Or if not, and maybe it's just in my mind, but it just seems to me it was an important part of the culture in reinforcing some of these mindsets.
That's certainly true, sir. And I think in terms of looking at when the Central Election Commission might actually set the date for the elections in October, no one is going to be more sensitive to those dates than the Bosnians.
Right.
So I think that we would work with the parties to ensure that the electoral process is not only held under conditions that are agreed by all, but that the process of moving ahead with the balloting is also as smooth and trouble-free as could possibly be. So we'll be working with them closely on the ground. Our embassy is very sensitive to the nuances of Bosnian politics and pays very careful attention to things like significant dates.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I yield. Thank you.
How many Americans? You know, Mr. Chairman, I can't give you an actual number. I'm going to have to get back to you with that, to do a little bit of research, and I'll get you a hard number. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
As our panel is sitting down, I'd like to thank Representative Laughlin and Laughlin, that is, and I'll make sure I pronounce Joe DeGuardi as well, for their help in making sure that we had a well-rounded group of witnesses, and I appreciate that very much. To our two former members, Representative Laughlin of Texas and DeGuardi from New York. Okay. 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 Wait.
Pronunciation's right there.
Okay.
On the sheet.
Okay, got that. Okay, but where's? Okay, got that. Okay, and what's that here? No, where's?
This one, so it's out of the way.
Okay, where's his bio? Oh, okay. But I don't have a bio on him. Is there a bio?
It's here in your hand. So, 1,
2, 3. Oh, there it is. Okay, got it. Senor. Okay, here we go.
Experts here on Bosnia. Oh, without.
I think you might be offended in saying their own name. They call themselves the Bosniaks.
We
We met eyeball to eyeball, but
good.
I just met his.
If you have a problem with Herzegovina, just say
University, yeah. Dublin. We've
Bosnia, I in Serbo-Croatian, which is the language they all speak. The I.
basically came to the United
No, I look
States
forward to
on a Fulbright.
actually meeting him properly. He's in Dublin, so he's not far
Yes,
from
he
where
is.
I
That
am.
means Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Right, and the other ones are Bosniaks.
Bosniaks or Bosnians, Bosniaks, yeah.
That's fine.
Are they but are they like Bosnians?
Well, they're the Muslims, is the
He's one
Croats,
of,
the Serbs, and the Bosniaks. The Bosniaks are
Are
the
Muslims?
Muslims.
Ah, I see, okay. Okay. Okay, we can hear it there. We have 4 witnesses to join us now for our second panel. First witness is Dr. Sasha Toporich, okay, a senior fellow and director of Mediterranean Basin and Middle East and Gulf Initiatives at Johns Hopkins University. He serves as the chairman of the organizing committee for the Bosnia-Herzegovina Vision 2020 project at the University Center for Transatlantic Relations. We have, now you're going to have to correct me if I'm wrong, Philippe LaRue. Philippe LaRue. Martin. Okay. He is the director for the Rule of Law, Justice, and Security at the United States Institute of Peace. Prior to this, he headed the legal department at the International civilian office in Kosovo and led the public law unit in the Office of High Representative in Sarajevo. He is the author of Diplomatic Counterinsurgency, Lessons from Bosnia-Herzegovina. Then we have with us Shirley Coyles DeGuardi, who is my dear friend, but I'm mispronouncing your last name, I'm sure. I've done that for years. Okay, you got it. And Joe, her husband Joe, who served with us in the United States Congress from New York. And I say, Congressman Lofgren, is you around? Are you here? He was here a moment ago. Way in the back. Thank both of you for your help in organizing this hearing. Shirley is a Balkans Affair advisor to the Albanian American Civic League. She is a returning witness to this subcommittee. She has a long record of writing and speaking out on political developments in the region, particularly on the topic of how to bring a lasting peace to Kosovo. And I've appreciated their input and guidance over the years. And then Kurt Bassinor. Say it again? Bassinor. Okay. He is the co-founder of the Democratization Policy Council, a global initiative for accountability and democracy promotion. He co-authored a recent report entitled, We There Yet? International Impatience versus a Long-Term Strategy for a Viable Bosnia. So, are we there yet? Okay, we're gonna find out. He too has worked for the Office of the High Representative in Sarajevo, the Balkan Action Council, as well as the Balkan Institute. So we welcome our witnesses. We'd ask that you try to keep your testimony down to 5 minutes. You could put whatever else into the congressional record, and then we'll have some dialogue. So, Doctor, you may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Rohrabacher, Ranking Member Meeks, members of the committee. Thank you very much for inviting me today to testify. I will keep my remarks brief, and I ask that my full testimony be entered into the record. Today's hearing, Legacy of a Dayton, Future of Bosnia-Herzegovina and the Western Balkans, could not come at a more critical time. In just 20 days, Bosnia and Herzegovina will pass a deadline by which it has to pass legislation to comply with the Constitutional Court to reform electoral law. There is no compromise political agreement in sight. Parliament and the Bosnian political leaders should be pressed by allies at home and abroad to pass the electoral law change before the October elections. The alternative to carry out the elections in October without the passing of the electoral law reform could bring Bosnia and Herzegovina into a constitutional and political chaos. Also, for 8 years, Bosnian political leaders failed to implement Sejdić-Finci European Court of Human Rights verdict that would allow minorities, such as Jews, to be elected president. These changes are prerequisite for Bosnia and Herzegovina to join the European Union. Other citizens, such as Ms. Zornic, also won the lawsuits against Bosnia and Herzegovina, as she was being found ineligible to stand for election to the House of Peoples and the presidency, as she refused to declare affiliation with any constituent people, namely Bosniaks, Serbs, Croats, but simply wanted to run for the office as a citizen of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Due to the political stalemate, citizens of city of Mostar have been deprived of voting rights for both 2012 and 2016 elections. This simply should not be the case in 2018. The leaders in Bosnia and Herzegovina have developed a bad habit of ignoring court rulings they dislike and to attend to important issues at the very last moment, and that often only when pressured by the European Union and the United States. Bosnia and Herzegovina must develop a new habit of respecting court judgments, even if politically unpopular. Parties in Bosnia and Herzegovina need to reform the electoral law, or we could face a crisis in the country and instability in the region. Simultaneously, they need to work on finding solution to all courts' verdicts in order to enable basic rights for all of its citizens. Inactivity can lead Bosnia and Herzegovina into dangerous political instability that will inevitably lead to regional instability, which will only play into Russia to further pursue her agenda. Milorad Dodik, president of Republika Srpska, one of the two sub-entities in Bosnia-Herzegovina who is sanctioned by the United States, continues to deny genocide over 8,000 Bosnian Muslims in Srebrenica. Close to Putin, his continued separatist rhetoric remains to be the highest threat to Bosnia-Herzegovina and regional stability. Given this, I would like to present the committee with 3 recommendations. Congress and the Trump administration should take a leadership role in finding a solution and strongly support our embassy in Bosnia-Herzegovina effort that work closely with the European Union in mediating positive solution to election law. It is encouraging that Wes Mitchell, our Assistant Secretary for European Eurasian Affairs, is now more engaged in the Balkans. The US should reach out to our European partners and request them to follow US sanctions on Milorad Dodik with a set of their own, as Dodik's separatist rhetoric continues to represent a serious threat to regional stability. To counter Russian influence, the United States should work with its NATO partners to reach political decision and activate the NATO membership action plan for Bosnia and Herzegovina as early as this July at the NATO's next summit in Brussels. This would also be an opportunity for Turkey to play a constructive role in advancing security and stability in the Western Balkans through NATO's institutions by helping bringing Bosnia and Herzegovina a step closer to the full NATO membership. Activation of the map of Bosnia and Herzegovina would help reduce widespread corruption and would send a strong signal to political elites to stop interfering in justice system currently under their heavy influence, and would reduce their elevated ethnic rhetoric with which they manipulated masses time and over again. Improving independence of judiciary system in Bosnia and Herzegovina is key to stopping political elites in using their mechanisms of power to prosecute business community leaders who hold different political views, often being racketeered by the politicians for not bowing to their pressures. In closing, a strong, democratic, multi-ethnic, and Euro-Atlantic Bosnia and Herzegovina is in the United States' interest. American leaders should do all they can to help this happen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Meeks, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My testimony will cover the following 3 questions. First, how Bosnia has arrived at the current electoral impasse. Second, what solutions have been... Of course. How Bosnia has arrived at the current electoral impasse. Second, what solutions have been put forward. And third, what can we learn about the continued efficacy of the Dayton Agreement? As far as the first question is concerned, Mr. Chairman, I think a useful way to understand the dynamic of the current electoral impasse in Bosnia today is to think of a complex, interconnected power grid in which a critical node is about to lose its energy supply. If we are unable to fix the supply of energy to this critical node in the next 6 months, other key components of the grid will be affected. The current electoral impasse in Bosnia originates from one of Bosnia's 2 federal entities, and that is the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Federation entity government has a legislative branch composed of a House of Representatives and a House of Peoples. In December 2016, the Constitutional Court of Bosnia declared certain provisions of Bosnia's election law that were regulating the election of delegates to the House of Peoples of the Federation to be unconstitutional. The Parliamentary Assembly has to date failed to enact new provisions. This has led to a legal vacuum, and this legal vacuum is at the very center of the electoral impasse we are facing today. Absent a solution, several components of Bosnia's governance structure could be paralyzed, given that the House of Peoples plays a critical role in the formation of governments both at the entity federation level but also at the state central level. Going back to my analogy, the Federation's House of People is a critical node in Bosnia's systems of governance. Moving on to my second point about the solutions that have been put forward, Mr. Chairman, the Constitutional Court's decision reignited an intense competition between political parties in the Federation and has reopened the issue of the representation of Bosnian Croats in its governing structures. This competition has taken the form of a dispute over various gerrymandering proposals. Political parties have proposed amendments through discussions led by the European Union and the United States. The proposals have so far all failed, as none have sought a genuine compromise. Looking forward, I think the United States and the EU should obviously remain very flexible vis-à-vis any potential solution, but I think an agreement on a solution should meet the following principles, and there are 5 of them. First, any solution should comply with the constitutional framework of Bosnia. Second, it should have the political support necessary to ensure passage before the relevant legislatures. Third, it should not further undermine Bosnia's capacity to ensure that its electoral system complies with the European Convention for Human Rights. Fourth, it should ensure that the right to vote and the right to be a candidate for a seat in the Federation House of Peoples is guaranteed for all cantonal delegates belonging to a constituent people. And finally, it should not further undermine Bosnia's governance structure. Moving on to the last question about Dayton's efficacy, Mr. Chairman, it's clear that the current electoral impasse is another illustration of the deficiencies faced by the complex governance structure established at Dayton. It is true that the Dayton Constitution is not perfect. It is worth remembering, however, that the Dayton Agreement is a peace agreement that was supported by the United States, the European Union, and Russia to stop a brutal war. It reestablished freedom of movement throughout the country. It allowed more than 1 million persons who had been displaced by the war to exercise their right to return to their homes under the peace agreement. Although progressing slowly and painfully, Bosnia is nevertheless progressing toward EU and NATO membership today. When compared to other recent peace processes, Dayton has been a clear success. Many voices have been suggesting a complete overhaul of Dayton over the last few years. I would caution that attempts to overhaul Dayton may be very hard to implement in reality. I think a more effective strategy would be to reform Dayton through a series of incremental agreements, and in order to avoid any further weakening of the central state, the United States and the EU should state that only a united Bosnia with a stronger central level of government would be able to join the EU and NATO. And finally, to be successful, I think the United States and the EU will need to ensure that both Serbia and Croatia play a positive role throughout this process. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll submit my remarks for the record, make a summary now, and I'd also like to submit 2 pieces for the congressional record, one a piece on ethnic politics in the Western Balkans, focusing on Bosnia and Macedonia, by my colleague Roland Joni, expert in international law and a senior fellow in political science at the University of College Dublin, and then the Albanian platform in Macedonia, which I'll refer to later. Well,
those items will be included in the record without objection, as will the extension of remarks will also be included.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. While the Dayton Accords ended the war in Bosnia in 1995, it did not resolve the Balkan conflict. The House Committee on Foreign Affairs made a very serious effort to reveal the realities of Slobodan Milosevic's 10-year occupation of Kosovo and genocidal march across the Balkans, which ultimately claimed at least somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 lives and displaced 4 million during the Bosnian War. Under pressure from your committee, the Clinton administration finally initiated NATO airstrikes against Serbia in March 1999, as we know, to bring an end to the war in Kosovo begun in 1998 as a continuation of the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. Nevertheless, the roots of the Balkan conflict remain unresolved to this day, and the crux of the problem lies in the signing of the Dayton Accords. Why? Because U.S. Balkan envoy Richard Holbrooke, then chief U.S. negotiator at Dayton, cast Serbian dictator and later indicted war criminal Slobodan Milosevic into the role of the peacemaker, and instead of a peace agreement that would have outlined the steps to restore Bosnia-Herzegovina to its pre-war reality as a society of multi-ethnic and multi-religious harmony among Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs, Dayton divided Bosnia-Herzegovina, as we've heard, into 2 entities with a weak federal government, and incredibly, Milosevic was rewarded with the recognition of a previously non-existent political entity called Republika Srpska. and it has left Bosnia-Herzegovina on the brink of being ungovernable ever since, because Srpska blocks the federal government from functioning for the benefit of all Bosnian citizens. The second reason why the roots of the Balkan conflict were not resolved at Dayton is rarely acknowledged by Western governments and foreign policy experts, namely that Milosevic agreed to arrive at the negotiations only if two conditions were met: that Albanians would not be allowed at the table and that Kosovo would not be part of the agenda. This set the stage for Milosevic's military attack on Kosovo in 1998. And by the way, he had always intended to carry out ethnic cleansing there before his troops invaded in Bosnia in 1992, but it was actually former Congressman Jody Aguardi, who I did not know at that time, and members of the Albanian American Civic League who were able to educate the US Congress about Milosevic's plans, thereby placing the spotlight on Milosevic that led to his temporary exit from Kosovo. Dayton's neglect of the Albanian issue is still a very live legacy, and the West's historical appeasement of Serbia is the principal problem. Belgrade has resorted to provoking violence in northern Kosovo, the area that has controlled and manipulated financially and politically ever since Kosovo came under UN protection at war's end in the summer of 1999. Unless the United States stops taking a back seat to Europe and the Balkans, Serbia will be admitted to the European Union, while simultaneously achieving what has always been its primary goal: the denial of Kosovo's sovereignty and the acquisition of northern Kosovo and Republika Srpska. The legacy of Dayton also includes the lack of reciprocity for Albanians in the Preševa Valley, where they're second and third-class citizens of Serbia, while the Kosovo Serbs have the highest level of human and civil rights of any minority group, I would add, in Europe. And the legacy of Dayton also resulted in the constitutional and systemic oppression and discrimination of Albanians in Macedonia. It's Macedonia that I believe the US government must now focus on. It's frequently forgotten that when the former Yugoslavia disintegrated, the Republic of Macedonia emerged as an independent state without violence in 1991, based on the cooperation of ethnic Albanians and ethnic Macedonians. Macedonia is the only country in the Western Balkans where no one ethnic group has a true majority. But the subsequent failure to bring equal human and civil rights to all ethnic groups in Macedonia led to armed conflict in 2001. To end the conflict, as we know, the EU and the US government entered into negotiations with the ethnic Macedonian and ethnic Albanian political leaders. That resulted in the signing of the Ohrid Framework Agreement, which was supposed to achieve the equitable representation of all national groups in the state's institutions, as well as the equitable distribution of resources. 17 years later, Ohrid implementation has stagnated in relation to judiciary, law enforcement, military, intelligence, and fiscal decentralization, and ethnic Macedonian domination is constitutionally entrenched and yet to be addressed. The current political crisis in Macedonia cannot be resolved short of grappling with the key Albanian grievances. Macedonia will never become a functioning democracy if it discriminates against 30 to 40% of its population Albanian and other non-Slavs. But again, achieving ethnic equality now is at risk once more in Macedonia. In January of 2018, the Macedonian parliament twice passed the law making Albanian the country's second official language, which was mandated in an agreement between Zoran Zaev's SDSM party and the ethnic Albanian parties that called the Albanian platform and used it to form the new government. Even so, as we speak, Macedonian president, starting in January, President Ivanov twice vetoed it, claiming that a second official language would threaten Macedonia's unity and territorial integrity. The Macedonian constitution requires the passage of this law after 2 votes in favor, but this is yet to happen because Ivanov has declined constitutionally to sign the law, and he's now stoking ethnic tensions that may have domestic and regional implications. Ending discrimination against ethnic Albanians by providing equal opportunity for economic and social growth in areas where Albanians are ethnic majorities can dramatically reduce the possibility of future armed conflict. And I'll conclude, the question remains whether the United States and the European Union will step forward to negotiate a timeline to achieve full equality of the Macedonian and Albanian communities before the country's admission to NATO. Especially in Macedonia, we've witnessed a foreign policy approach in the U.S. government for the past 20 years that focused on stability at all costs, as you have often pointed out, Mr. Chairman, instead of making conflict prevention and human rights the center of our engagement with the region. Hence, post-Dayton, the Balkan conflict is still unresolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of this committee. I welcome this timely hearing, which will draw overdue attention to a more than decade of negative trajectory in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the reasons for that. This is an area in which the United States and the West have been deeply engaged for over 2 decades, and where we have a wide array of incentives and mandates that could be of utility. We need to understand why we got here to discuss this wider matter. Essentially, the United States started to take a backseat and downshift its engagement in the region as a whole, and particularly in Bosnia's case in about 2006, because there was a understanding that the carrots of EU and NATO membership were going to impel forward movement. So the only question at that point was, in the common understanding, was the question of the velocity of forward movement. I think the events of since 2006 demonstrate that's not the case. So at its root, the issue at hand is not a question of Croat rights and constituent peoples. Rather, it's one of deeper incumbency burrowing and self-protection of entrenched elites. And this is a manifestation of a far wider, broader, and deeper longer-running problem. Bluntly put, Bosnia-Herzegovina's political elite constitutes a political, business, organized crime, media nexus across the ethnic spectrum. I'm not picking on any particular group. Their primary incentives are, can they keep what they stole? Can they remain positioned to keep stealing? And can they remain unaccountable both politically and legally? This system allows them to do that. Nothing the EU can offer them is better than that, which is why there hasn't been forward movement. So, while there's no shortage of culpability to go around across the full spectrum of Bosnia's political elites, the fact remains that the alliance between Republika Srpska President Milorad Dodik and HDZ Bosnia-Herzegovina leader Dragan Čović has steadily eroded the progress achieved in the first decade since the war, at great taxpayer cost, by the way, with the aim of effectively carving out secure ethnic fiefdoms of absolute control. This will ultimately lead to state collapse if it's not resisted, so it demands resistance. The escalating challenge to Bosnia-Herzegovina's sovereignty that we've witnessed over the past decade has brought out the worst in Serbia and Croatia. They are both involved in Bosnia's internal politics to a degree that was not permitted for the first decade since after the war. In fact, all the nationalist agendas that were prevalent in the 1990s are operating without restraint because we're not restraining them anymore. We were the enforcer of the Dayton Order. We've ceased to be the enforcer of the Dayton Order. There are no rules, not because they're not being enforced. All the ingredients for organized violence, including or escalation of a violent interethnic incident, are there in terms of weapons. I could come back to that in the Q&A. So there's a deep popular hunger for a rules-based political system in Bosnia-Herzegovina that's fully compatible with collective protections and direct political representation, which you don't have. Bosnians can't write their congressman because they don't vote for them on a territorial basis. They vote on a party list. So there's no accountability above the municipal level for anybody in Bosnia's political system. So the strategic goal for the United States, EU, and our other Western allies on the Peace Implementation Council, which enforces the Dayton Peace Agreement, needs to be arriving at a governance system that allows for functional democratic representation, accountability, and good governance. This needs to be the post-election focal point of American foreign policy, for which we need to be preparing now. So in very brief terms, what is to be done? 1, The United States needs to fill the deterrent gap in Bosnia. There is no deterrent to violence right now, not legally because we don't have a foothold for it, but practically the EU-operated deterrent force, which NATO used to do under our command up until 2004, is not suited to task. There needs to be American participation in a reinforced Chapter 7 deterrent for which we have the mandate. We don't need to ask anybody's permission, including troops in Brčko and Mostar prior to the October elections. Second, we need to replace the moribund leadership of the Office of the High Representative and reinvigorate the international civilian enforcement of the Dayton Peace Agreement with an American High Representative. There's nothing in the Dayton Agreement or anything else that prevents that. That is a lack of political will. If there's Western unity, it can happen. Second, on this particular issue of the Lubitsch case and the Constitutional Court ruling, there needs to be an effort to try to arrive at a compromise prior to the elections, but recognition that might not happen. And by getting in on the security end at the front end, we reduce the potential downside of not arriving in that compromise. And third, we need to focus on the fundamental problem of why Bosnia is the laggard of the region, which is a lack of accountable, representative, democratic governance. And this was the reason that there was popular unrest in 2014, and it may reemerge. Thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you very much for your testimony to all the witnesses. We are joined by Brad Sherman, California, and we're going to pay him the courtesy of having the first shot at the witnesses today.
Thank you. Yugoslavia shows a clash of the two great principles of diplomacy and international law: self-determination and territorial integrity. And it is not surprising that the United States is schizophrenic on the clash of these two principles, since only two great wars have been fought on our territory, leaving Ballymatosen in 1812 aside. The first, launched in 1776, was a great war for self-determination, and in 1861 we fought hard to preserve our territorial integrity. There seems to be some illogic into how we applied these two principles. We were for self-determination of the individual republics of the former Yugoslavia. Then we were for the territorial integrity of those republics when sections of the republics tried to assert their self-determination. We except with regard to Kosovo. So we did not support the territorial integrity of the Republic of Serbia. We did support the territorial integrity of Croatia and saw the ethnic cleansing of Serbs from Krajina. We support the territorial integrity of Bosnia. We now support the territorial integrity of Kosovo when northern Kosovo wants to secede. So it was okay for Kosovo to secede from Serbia, but not northern Kosovo to secede from Kosovo. One would think that this is all illogic and has no pattern, but there is a clear pattern. We're anti-Russian and therefore anti-Serbian. And we are refighting the Cold War over again. And I'll point out that Russia has been equally illogical and has been pro-Orthodox Slav and anti the other groups in the area in its behavior. How many Serbs were ethnically cleansed from Krajina? Does anyone know?
I believe the figure that's most commonly talked about is 250,000.
And has the West urged them to be compensated in any way, or is there any chance they'll get their land back?
West has definitely encouraged refugee return.
Encouraged,
facilitated, but you know, the numbers are small.
Has Croatia been excluded from international organizations until they make good? No, because the West is lining up against Slavic Orthodox instinctively as a anti-Russian approach. I'm going to shift to a different area. That is, Muslims in this world have been faced with genocide twice, Kosovo, and Bosnia. It was the United States that bombed a Christian country twice in order to protect Muslims. Has enough been done to educate the Muslim world that the United States, hardly the oppressor of Muslims, was the decisive country, the only country to come in from the, just about the only country to come in from the outside and kill people by the score, Christians I might add, in order to protect Muslims? Does the average person in Jakarta or Rabat know this? I realize you folks focus on the former Yugoslavia, but what has been done by the governments of Bosnia and Montenegro and Kosovo to send people out to buy advertising time, to deal with Muslim organizations, and to make sure that every mullah in the world knows that it was America that bombed Christians to save Muslims when no one else would? Does anyone know whether they, and what portion of their budget do they devote to this effort? Yes.
I would first like to, if you don't mind, Congressman Sherman, make a statement that I think is very, very.
You know, I have 27 seconds more.
No, I'll be very quick, but you're talking about Kosovo as a Muslim nation. It's just not the case. All Albanians are Muslim.
Is Kosovo a majority Muslim nation?
It's majority secular Muslim living side by side and in harmony with Orthodox Christians, Roman Catholics, and Jews. So I just want to.
Oh, you've dealt with me on the committee long enough to know that there's a separate tradition for Sherman.
Special rule for you that will permit some dialogue after you're done.
Okay. Yes, I'm. Obviously, throughout Europe, there's a decline of religious participation. But
we didn't. I just want to say the U.S. wasn't, attacking a Christian nation. I thought it was, but I did push it. But the U.S. Was not perceiving this, in my understanding, as an attack on Muslim nations, an attack against Christians in order to save Muslims.
no, we bombed Serbs in order to save Kosovars, and probably did the right thing. But it just so happens that that Kosovo is part of the greater Muslim majority world, whether regardless of where people are on Friday at noon.
Right, except that Albanians are Albanians first, people of faith second.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Just thought that.
Okay. Okay. But does anybody have a comment? Has the government of Kosovo or the government of Bosnia-Herzegovina devoted any substantial part of its worldwide efforts to helping the United States with this problem we have in the Muslim world?
Okay, is that a question?
That's a question.
Let's go. We got 1, 2, 3, 4.
And I don't know is an acceptable answer.
Well, Mr. Congressman, I think digging out the ghosts of the past 20 years ago and beyond doesn't help anyone in today's hearing, but I would say all the countries of the Western Balkans opted to join the European Union. Serbia and President Vučić is a positive leader of Serbia now. He was at SAIS, he was here with the Vice President Biden, he was coming well received in Washington, D.C., very often in Brussels. Serbia has made a commitment to join the European Union, and everybody recognizes a special relationship with Russia in respect to all the countries, whether with the Muslim populations, and Serbia has a Muslim populations, Bosnia has a Muslim populations, all of these countries.
Doctor, this is time to answer the question, but the question is, what do the governments of Kosovo and Bosnia do to help educate people from Rabat to Jakarta about the heroic efforts of the United States? That's the question.
I think these efforts, Mr. Congressman, are world in history everywhere. Everybody talks about, everybody are grateful to the United States that they stopped the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Kosovo.
And so everybody in Jakarta and Rabat knows. Okay.
I believe so.
Congressman, I cannot speak on behalf of each government, and namely the government of Kosovo or of Bosnia, on the diplomatic steps or other steps that they're taking. What I can tell you, for having worked in the region, is this is that it is absolutely clear when you walk in the streets of Pristina, or even if you walk in Bosnia, that the population is very grateful for the role that the U.S. has played. Very often, if you walk in Pristina, you will recognize that statues or streets or even coffee shops are named after prominent Americans who have played a very positive role. And I would imagine if you look at the track record, the diplomatic track record of Bosnia or Kosovo, that both have been very helpful in helping the U.S. in pursuing its interests on all sorts of fronts. But I cannot speak on behalf of the specific campaigns or the resources that have been invested by these governments to promote the role that the U.S. has played.
Congressman Sherman, I can tell you about Kosovo because Albanians are so pro-American. As soon as 740 Kosovar Albanians ended up going to fight with ISIS, this created enormous alarm, and the NGOs and the Kosovo government and our embassy and USAID in Kosovo immediately came together and began a very, very effective and dramatic program to make sure that no one else returned, and to demonstrate the fact that Kosovo and Albanians in other parts of the Western Balkans would be committed to preventing ISIS from moving into Western Europe and certainly into their own societies. It's been well established.
Congressman Sherman, I think since Ms. Cloys Dioguardi spoke about Kosovo, I could speak about Bosnia. The governance system in Bosnia-Herzegovina would impede such a campaign actually being adopted because there would be difference of opinion over the American intervention. So I think that's a reflection of what we've been discussing earlier today.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Well, I think if nothing else, Mr. Sherman has, let's face it, I mean, how far do you want to go back? And I think 7th century or so might be is about the right time frame, and the infractions are, well, I mean, that's about where this stuff starts, right? And maybe it's not important to Americans, but it's certainly important to the people that live in these places, and I think it's important for us as Americans to acknowledge it. It's part of the situation, right? So, but we are where we are, right? So maybe let's talk about some tangible things. I missed something, Mr. Leroux, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, in your opening statement about the electric grid. Can you elaborate what you were talking about specifically there?
Sure, Congressman, and I apologize if the analogy was not too clear. What I was trying to get at is to highlight the importance of the House of Peoples in the Federation for the entire governance structure of Bosnia. The delegates in the House of Peoples have a role to play, a crucial role to play, in the formation of the government at the entity level in the Federation entity. So they're responsible to approve the president and the vice president of the Federation. They also have the responsibility to approve the cabinet, but they also have a role to play vis-a-vis the House of Peoples in the state level parliamentary assembly, in that they are responsible to elect delegates to the House of Peoples at the state level. And moreover, as Kurt was mentioning earlier, the presidency of Bosnia can rely, based on the constitution, on a mechanism which is called the Vital Entity Interest Mechanism, which is a veto mechanism. So any member of the presidency can refer to a caucus in the House of Peoples at the Federation a decision and then block that decision to that. So the House of People, that's what I was trying to get at.
Okay.
They're a critical node that can block.
Yeah, and I want to make sure I understand that correctly, and I think that Mr. Bussiner has, am I pronouncing that?
Bussiner.
Bussiner, has kind of codified it easily for Western people, right? What's the problem here? And as much as, from my standpoint, I don't think America wants to decide. Like, we want the people of Bosnia to decide, but I think you codified it correctly. They have little impetus, the people in the position to decide, to make any changes because it suits their interest to keep it exactly the way it is. We don't want to be heavy-handed. I mean, I think America unduly gets characterized and we get called imperialist enough as it is, right? We're just trying to help people get along and solve problems and stop the killing and so on and so forth. But so let me talk to you about a couple of things. Filling the deterrent gap. Let's be real specific. You're talking about troops on the ground as an impetus, and would this be another NATO mission, or you're saying that Americans?
Yes, I'm saying as part, certainly not a majority of such a force. Right now, just to be clear, presently, and this flows back to the Dayton Agreement, Annex 1A, NATO was the military element of the enforcement mechanism.
Right.
So that was handed over to the European Union as of the end of 2004. Still NATO forces, effectively under a different flag. That force is now 600 troops. They couldn't defend themselves if challenged. The theory is that they would be reinforced from without by air. That might take time. And by then, you're not deterring, you're reacting. So, as I said, all the elements for potential violence are there. In terms of weapons, it's roughly 1 per household in terms of average firearms ownership or possession. And this is stuff that would would be illegal under American law, to put it clearly. It doesn't get used, which speaks to the forbearance of your average Bosnian of every flavor and stripe, but it could be. So yes, the deterrent number that the DSACUR, deputy NATO chair, had put forward was a brigade, which is roughly 3,000 to 4,000 troops. To actually fulfill that role, I think a battalion of American troops as part of as a challenge to our other NATO allies to fill that gap would be important, particularly in Brčko and Mostar, which are the most likely ethnic flashpoints. And we don't need a new mandate for that. We have it.
And that's why you picked Brčko and Mostar, just because of the specific.
That's where it could kick off in a lot of other places. Brčko is the hinge, which is the circuit breaker of any attempt at secession by the Republika Srpska, because it's not territorially contiguous if that's not possessed, and that's why in RS government maps it's part of the RS. And Mostar because of the ethnic divide there.
So this is kind of there'll be, I think, a long answer to a short question. You know, responsible governance where the citizens are tied to the person that they elect, and more importantly, the elected official is tied to the citizen. You seem to have a lot of answers, or at least a lot of thoughts about answers. How do they get to that point?
Well, you mean how do we get from the blockage of the political elites to getting to a system that's actually responsive to citizens?
How do they change the system? Like, you keep on saying we.
Yeah. No, right? That's fair. I mean,
I don't know if we want to be involved if we don't have to be, right?
Well, our best value added, let's be intellectually honest, we can't fix Bosnia. What we can do is create more conducive conditions for Bosnians who do want to fix Bosnia to get traction. Right now, the Dayton system is an initiative-destroying machine, and the two tools of patronage and fear are heavily amplified in the hands of the political elites, and they work as a package deal. That's why the public sector is so important, because you're not going to vote against the powers that be if you're afraid of losing your job and you're not sure your vote is secret. It's very integrated. By taking fear out of that equation, or at least radically reducing it by making clear to everybody, violence is off the table. Right now, that's not the case. Everybody's worst fear now is feasible in a way that it was not in 2006. So simply doing that and making clear we're going to enforce the bad old rules until there are new rules and try to catalyze that is, it would be an enormous help to moving forward. I think there is a potential constituency for a very different sort of Bosnia-Herzegovina, to be honest, which needs to involve a critical mass, a supermajority of each self-defined group, which, as the chairman noted, is more than 3. So that would be the mechanics of it, by declaring we're going to enforce Dayton, we're not going to allow violence, and you need to move towards something better to ever be able to be functional or a member of our clubs.
Well, it is, all right. I've been marking a little time for Mr. Meeks to come back, but I'll just move forward and hope that he can get back in time for his input. First of all, let me just note, and again, with the first witness. We had a good interaction there. I do believe that the long-term idea that I think is dominating our abilities to function is the idea that all of these people are going to be in the EU and we're going to be able to walk away. And as I say, my vision of what's going on in Europe is that the EU is disintegrating and it will not be there to provide this kind of solution. So maybe we can try to focus on, and as we've done here, what we can do to make these groups who live in proximity to each other not activate themselves into killing each other. And we have, the Bosniaks then are basically Muslim people like in Albania, but they're not Albanian. Is that correct? Do they speak Albanian, the Bosniaks? What language do the Bosniaks speak?
Serbo-Croatian.
Serbo-Croatian, okay. And the Serbs speak Serbo-Croatian, and the Croatians speak just Croatian. No? Okay. Well, they all speak the same language, is that right?
Different alphabets.
This is, they kind of look alike too, don't they? Okay. They look alike and they speak alike. Okay. It seems to me that we should be able, maybe it's sort of like going next door or down the street because they hear there's a ruckus down the street, but maybe you don't have the solution when you tell these guys, you really shouldn't be fighting with your wife like that because you're making so much noise when you know that perhaps they've got to settle it for themselves. I would hope that we could come up with trying to be an honest broker. And you know, when I was a kid, when I was like 20 years old, I was driving down this road near the harbor in Los Angeles, and there was this big gang of people, and right in the middle of them were these guys who were fighting. I mean, they were like, and it was really bloody. I mean, they were sort of big thug guys, and they were just beating on each other. And one guy was really, I mean, he's getting covered with blood. The biggest guy was the one who was getting covered with blood. And I walked up there, and I said, you know, isn't there some way we can solve this? And they punched me in the face. I remember that forever. Luckily, we did not get punched in the face, and we did have some positive role when all this killing was going on back in the 1990s. I actually think the United States played a very positive role there. And the fact that they haven't been killing people and that carnage has been at least halted, that's something I think America can be proud of. And I do think that it probably took us an ability in order to accomplish that. I think we probably did have to exercise the bombing of Belgrade, and we did. And I think after that, it stopped. Now, with that said, I will say that in the years since, I have found at this point in time, after all this time has passed, the Serbs seem to be open-minded towards working to some solutions. They haven't recognized Kosovo yet, but the Serbs are very willing to try to have this alteration of the borders so that this area where 90% of the people are Serbs then become part of Serbia, and another area that's about 80% Kosovar becomes part of Kosovo. They're willing to make that kind of an agreement, and I think we should praise them for that. The Kosovars aren't, and I think the Kosovars aren't because our people think that getting all these people into the EU is the ultimate solution, and the EU will not put up with any changes in boundaries. So I think that maybe we should be operating independent of that kind of concept, because I don't think it's going to work. One thing and as we're discussing here, we're discussing whether or not protecting individual rights and human rights in a country and then having at the same time protecting group rights is going to work. Now, what we heard about what was going on in Macedonia. And the Macedonians speak a different language. They have two languages there. Doesn't seem to be the problem in Bosnia. And however, in Macedonia, one of the big things that's causing an upheaval is that they won't let people speak that second language. Let's note that and see, okay, are the Macedonians going to be able to get along, and are they going to be able to succeed with that concept? Because correct me if I'm wrong, Shirley, and that is that the Macedonians, while they have their language, the Albanians have this separate language, and the Albanians would like to have their language. If they do not have it, do the Albanians in Macedonia consider speaking Albanian to be their individual right? Is my question to you, Shirley.
Albanians, by the way, thank you. Albanians in general in Macedonia actually speak both languages. But I go back to the fact again that this is the one clearly multi-ethnic state in the Western Balkans, and you can't have a 30 to 40% of the population being discriminated against. And
in their language.
But not just the language. The way the language law works is for areas that are predominantly Albanian would have the right to speak Albanian and use Albanian in state institutions. And right now, they do not.
And they consider that to be their individual right, like you would have it in, I'm trying to relate this to Bosnia, when in Bosnia, they at least don't have this language division, which I think is.
Right, but also, Chairman Rohrabacher, it's not just an issue of language rights. The Ohrid Agreement, I should say, in 2001, that was negotiated by both the U.S. and the EU with both ethnic Albanians and ethnic Macedonians, brought the conflict of 2001, the armed conflict, to an end. But it also set forth a program, a plan. It's not that different, actually, from the initial idea behind the Dayton Accords for Bosnia, to begin to bring about true equality and fairness in the region. That has not happened. So we've had, 18 years go by.
Equality and fairness, to be fair, is a nebulous term. No, and what we have so I'm trying to bring some lessons here from one part of the Balkans to the other part of the Balkans. That, here, as I say, you've got people in Bosnia who have basically the same language, and they really go back a long way. They're basically part of the same cultural unit in the world, even though they have different religions. By the way, when I went through the Balkans many years ago, I went to in Croatia, I went into this really burned out Catholic church. And the first thing I said, I go, wow, the Muslims really came in here and destroyed this church, didn't they? Oh no, this was burned by the Serbs. the Serbs, because they're Orthodox and these are Roman Catholics. And, I will have to say that to Americans, this all sounds so, how do you put it? It's almost otherworldish. I mean, this is not something that we recognize at all where Catholics will be killing one another, even though, because one's Orthodox and one's not. But if we're going to be the force, if we are going to be the force for bringing about a peaceful world in this area, I guess we've got to understand that. Okay, Shirley, go right ahead, but then I'm going to let other people comment.
Just one thing, wouldn't the United States, though, recognize that we don't want discrimination against ethnic groups? And when you have a majority who is not, a huge majority that's not Slav, not ethnic Macedonian, you have that group, you have the predominance of one ethnic group making the groups, not just Albanians alone, in a second and third class position in their country. And I think that's something that our democratic situation would, fundamentally oppose. In other words, it's not just a question of people getting an individual right.
Well, it's people being discriminated against, et cetera. So, yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, regarding the role of Serbia and Kosovo, I wanted to bring to your attention as well that from the perspective of Kosovo, Kosovo is an independent state that has been recognized by more than 100 countries, including the United States and most countries in the EU. So for Serbia to talk about an exchange of territory, what Serbia or Belgrade is doing is they are openly talking about carving up and infringing upon the territorial integrity and the sovereignty of an independent state. I think what is also important to understand is that Serbia and Belgrade has been involved in acts of provocation. They've sent trains with a lot of religious symbols down to Kosovo to create disruption. So to categorize the role of Serbia, I think as a helpful, reasonable contributor, my sense is that we need to take into account these actions that Belgrade has contemplated recently. And Kosovo has been involved with Belgrade in a number of conversations and discussions that were facilitated by the European Union, trying to get to a number of arrangements to not to facilitate, but to normalize their relationships. So from my perspective, Kosovo has been playing a very mature, transparent, and constructive role in trying to engage with Serbia on normalizing their relationships.
I haven't found them very cooperative. I've been having conversations with Serbs and Kosovars over the years, and I certainly supported Kosovo in their efforts to be independent. Since then, personally, I can just testify that I have found the Kosovars to be much less likely to want to cooperate. Now, the Serbs, on the other hand, won't officially recognize anything, but they will discuss issues and try to come to compromises, and at least that's my experience with them. Let me offer Brad 2 more minutes and 2 more minutes, and then if Mr. Meeks has not arrived, by the way, you wanted to jump in, I could tell.
Well, Mr.
We'll
Chairman.
give our and people a chance. 2 minutes, or what would you like to say?
Well, I think in respect to European Union, I share your concerns, but however, European Union is a strong partner for the Western Balkans at this point in time, and regardless what the hypothetically future of Europe may look like, I think it's important for us to talk to our European allies and have their strong action together with ours in fixing the Western Balkans as an unfinished business as soon as possible, because enhancing the rule of law, enhancing the European standards of democracy to the Western Balkan as not geographical background, but that your Balkans are the part of Europe. You can fly 45 minutes from Sarajevo to Vienna. It's in immediate European interest of security, and thus, as our allies, our security and national interest, that we push the Europeans to work with us stronger to put these things right in the Western Balkans. That's what I wanted to say. And another one more, if I may, on Macedonia, I think we should strongly support Zaev government with all the being said today, but they are working very seriously with Greek counterparts to address the name issue problem that Greece blocked for their joining NATO and joining European Union. We finally have pro-European, pro-Euro-Atlantic government in Macedonia that also, I think you will be pleased to hear, thanks to our former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Hojti, who directly intervened with the President Ivanov and other to unblock the stalemate there and give a legitimately elected government a mandate. So they are really working, and finally we have some good news from Macedonia. I think we should keep the eye on getting this issue with the name of Greece solved so that they can move towards the EU and NATO.
You deserve to get that in the record. Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
Okay. 2 quick points to follow up. First, on the European Union, I definitely think that catalyzing a common Western position, because we've been atomized. There's been a transatlantic divide in our posture and approach toward the region, which not just malign actors from the outside, but mischievous actors within the Western Balkans have taken full advantage of. Catalyzing that position is going to take American leadership. I think it would be welcome in many quarters. Second, very quickly on Macedonia, that is the only relatively good news story in the region, in my view, for the past year, is the transition last year. There's a lot left to do. Sasha has mentioned the name issue regarding NATO and the EU. I would add one other element. Resolution of the unresolved cases of interethnic violence that happened during the Gruevski regime, uncovering them in independent investigations, which the government, to its credit, has said it wants to do, but there has been scant international enthusiasm for that. I think that is going to be essential to developing a democratic system where there can be nobody who corners the market like Nikola Gruevski had. So I just wanted to add that to the record.
Well, thank you very much. I give my colleagues a couple minutes to make closing remarks. Brad, you got 2 minutes for closing.
Very quick question.
Go for it.
Does the government of Kosovo send the troops to Afghanistan or Iraq?
Yes,
how many?
Yes, they have. I don't have the current number, Congressman, I'm sorry about that. But
Any idea?
Albania has. And
So is Albania, right?
I know Albania has. And Albania has accepted the MEK, which took a... but then there were over 700 individuals from Kosovo that joined ISIS?
Yes, but there are more people joined ISIS from England and other Western countries.
Well, England's an enormously much larger country.
But I wanted to point out what the response was, and it was a very effective response, and I think our State Department would confirm that it's not my personal.
I would simply make the point, our State Department asks for way too little from those who have benefited from American action. We have not asked the community of Muslims in Bosnia to send representatives from one end of the Muslim world to the other. We have not insisted that the Kosovo government do the same. And when people look back and say, why did America fail to engage in the world, the fault will not just be on those who argued against engagement, but those who've argued for engagement and then didn't push our allies and beneficiaries for reciprocity. And the idea that asking for reciprocity is anti-engagement, I think is short-sighted. So I would hope, I don't blame Kosovo and the Muslims of Bosnia for doing less than I would like to see them do to help us. I blame a State Department that hasn't explained that whether we're dealing with a Japan that has lived under our protection in great wealth for 70 years and didn't have a single soldier on the ground in Afghanistan, or whether it is Kosovo, which does not have a major outreach to the Muslim community on our behalf from Rabat to Jakarta. Those who ask little from our allies are setting us up for less involvement from the American people. I yield back.
Return to Mr. Bassiner. So, I'm sure you're a smart guy. Troops on the ground in Bosnia seems, I don't know, a little politically untenable at the moment, maybe.
Unpalatable, for sure.
So, if that's the case, let's just say it is, for the conversation's sake. Things keep on moving towards the inevitable date without any resolution. Who's going to fill the void if we don't? And how will that be filled?
Well, right now on the docket for reinforcement for the current force is a British Reserve Battalion. I definitely think they would have to be part of a on-the-ground, in-situ reinforcement.
But that will be after the fact?
That will be after the fact. That will not, I mean, they could get it ahead of the curve too. there would need to be European Union unanimity on that, which is not being catalyzed at present. So right now we're skating on very thin ice, to be if we're intellectually honest about it.
So those are that's the friendly actor. I guess I was looking for more of the other side of the coin.
I see where you're going. Look, I would not put it past other malign actors to fill voids, particularly Russia, particularly in Republika Srpska. However, again, I mean, if there is any place on planet Earth where a united West, which is not united right now, has more leverage, potential leverage, than the Western Balkans, including Bosnia-Herzegovina, specifically with the mandates that flow from the Dayton Agreement, I don't know where it is. So if that void is being filled, if that's a vacuum, that's on us.
I don't disagree. Describe for me, if you will, if you can, what the filling of the void, whether it's Russia and the Republika Srpska or Turkey, elsewhere, et cetera, what does it look like physically?
Well, physically, it could take many forms. Obviously, there's Russian training of the Republika Srpska Ministry of Interior Special Forces going on, about to open a new training center outside Banja Luka. We've seen, I mean, this is purely speculative, but we're in speculative territory here. We've seen Vladimir Putin take bold moves to put us on the back foot. That's what happened in Syria as a result of being in the doghouse for Ukraine. Would I put it past him flying in paratroopers into Banja Luka? No, I wouldn't. Do I think it's imminent? No. Could it happen? Yes. We're not controlling the airspace the way we did immediately after the war. It's open season. This is a territory that we could secure, not to predetermine a solution, but to prevent really negative solutions or degradation of the situation. We're not. That's something that could be dealt with in the immediate term and certainly should be before October as tensions rise.
Thanks, Chair. I yield.
All right. Well, we'll just close up with this. A couple observations on my part. And when we talk about what's going on there now, we realize that at one point, when I first became a member of Congress, there were people who were slaughtering one another. You had the Serbs going down into Kosovo and just saying, we don't care if you want to be independent or not. You raise your head up and we're going to cut it off. And it became so intense that finally the Western Europe, the United States, acted. And again, there are all kinds of mistakes that have been made, but I think that we should understand just the fact that we've been able to play that role in stopping that bloodshed and keeping it from reigniting all these years is a great accomplishment, and it speaks well of our motives. We've been warned that there are people who don't have those motives. They're provocateurs, the Russians and the Turks, that they do not have this same motive that has motivated us and our European allies to try to calm the situation down. Maybe they aren't trying to calm the situation down. I don't know. One thing I do know that we have a horrible, if the Muslims of that part of the world, right there in the Balkans, if they become a radical element in this planet, on this planet, if they are radicalized into the radical Islamic movement, it will be a disaster for the cause of peace, a disaster for Europe, a disaster for the United States. And so we have to make sure, whether it's Albania or whether it's Kosovo, or whatever country we're talking about, Macedonia or whatever, that those Islamic people do not feel that they're so unfairly treated and the situation is so bad for them, that they will be susceptible to this radical Islamicization that will lead them to become terrorists and killers, because we know that type of dynamic exists in this world today. Now, I hope that we've learned a lot, and it's interesting that Bosnia is the place where we can take a look at all of this as sort of in a laboratory almost, to see how we can work with people, and in Bosnia, working people at close proximity who have all of these traits, where of Serbs and Croatians, and yes, and Muslims. And so with that said, I think we've learned a lot today. I think it's been good to have Brad. Thank you for stopping in. And we thank you for stopping in as well, Mr. Perry. And I thank our witnesses. I'm Congressman Dana Rohrabacher, and I'm the chairman of this subcommittee, and it is now adjourned.
It was a pleasure.